Hi, and so today we have a very special speaker, Rafi Gassel. So he has been very active, very methodic, very systematic about promoting a solution to Israel-Palestine of federation. The name of his federation that he's working on with a number of other people very actively is Eretz-Ard. We are very glad to have him on this channel today and to have you be able to hear from him and learn more about Eretz-Ard. So we're going to give the floor to him now.
Thank you, Rebecca. Hi, my name is Rafi. I live in Jerusalem, Israel. I work in biotechnology. I've been living in Israel for 15 years. And on the side, I try to promote peace, do peace activism. And maybe 8 months ago or so, I started working with a friend of mine named Zahir to create a plan for a federation for one state or one country made up of states in Israel, Palestine, including Gaza, sort of a 50-50 based federation. Similar to maybe Emmanuel's federation that you had talked about, where it was a 2/3, 1/3 federation. But we wanted to see, well, if you try to take that and expand it to include Gaza, what would it look like? So we started drawing up a plan for it. We made maps and we wrote a constitution document, etc. I'll load the slides, share screen. Let's see how that works. Share. Is that working right? You see this screen? Your screen sharing, okay. Okay, the Eretz-Ard political framework. Eretz means land, Ard is Arabic, meaning land also. The Eretz-Ard political framework. The Eretz-Ard political framework is a proposal to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict by means of a federal political model that is meant to provide full equality for both Jews and Palestinian people on both an individual and a collective level. The key principles are unity of the land and recognition of the connection of both people's historic and cultural ties to the entire land, while providing cultural autonomy for both people within a federal political framework. This way. So 3 main topics. The overall point, perspective of my talk is: what is a federation? What is federalism? The advantage of federalism in the context of Israel-Palestine, and the Eretz-Ard solution. What is our proposal using federalism to resolve the Israel-Palestine conflict? Okay, federalism is a mixed or compound mode of government that combines a general government, a central or federal government, with regional governments, provincial, state, cantonal, territorial, or other subunit governments, whatever you want to call them, the pieces that make up your country, in a single political system. Its distinctive feature, first embodied in the Constitution of the United States, is a relationship of parity between the 2 levels of government. It can thus be defined as a form of government in which powers are divided between 2 levels of government of equal status. Examples of federation are the United States, India, Brazil, Malaysia, Mexico, Russia, Germany, Canada, Switzerland, Bosnia-Herzegovina, etc., and many more. The advantages of federalism in the context of Israel-Palestine. 1, it helps preserve the cultural autonomy of the various ethnic groups and cultural groups existing in various regions, facilitates local control and democratic participation in the economic development of each region and fair distribution of land and resources, maintains a balance of power between wealthy and heavily populated urban centers and rural, less populated regions, particularly in places like the United States. Some federations are used more like Switzerland, where they're trying to divide between ethnic groups, and here you can do a little of both. Help maintain a demographic parity of representation on the main national groups, Jews and Palestinians, on a federal level. So that's what I'm going to show in my presentation. In our proposal, encourage cooperation and coexistence on a local level among populations who live near each other, while at the same time providing a federal framework that manages countrywide necessities such as defense, economy, currency, foreign policy, healthcare, and constitutional rights for all people. Okay, the advantage of federalism in the context of Israel and Palestine, right? First, I'm going to talk about the Palestinian Israelis or Palestinians/Arabs in Israel. There are around 2 million Palestinians or Arabs that live within the internationally recognized boundaries of Israel and East Jerusalem, which is not internationally recognized. 16% of the non-Jewish Arabic-speaking population in Israel refer to themselves as Arab Israelis. The other 84% call themselves Palestinians. They consider themselves either Palestinian Israelis or just Palestinian Arabs. And you combine that with all the Palestinians in the West Bank, it's a well above 90% of the Arabic-speaking population call themselves Palestinians. So that's how they identify. Around 2 million Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza are refugees or descendants of refugees in what's now Israel. And Palestinians consider Israel to be part of historic Palestine. And here in this map, I show the major centers of where Arab Israelis or Palestinian Israelis live, mainly up in the north in the Galilee. There's a large collection. There's also Druze in red, and there's Circassians. These are also Maronite Christians. In my map, I separated them, but they're also Arabic speaking. There are along the seam between the West Bank and the coastal region of Israel, there are several Arab population centers, also East Jerusalem, as well as Bedouin Palestinians in the Negev, in the south. So that's where the population of the Arabs in Israel. In Jewish Israelis in Palestine, there's around 850,000. 12% of Jewish Israelis live in the West Bank or East Jerusalem. What the international community considers should be the Palestinian state. You can see where these sort of territory, it's done by population in this map. The largest amount of them are near Jerusalem, in the Jerusalem envelope area, also along the Tel Aviv region, sort of as a suburb of Tel Aviv. It's called Samaria. Jewish people consider the West Bank to be Judea and Samaria, the cradle of Jewish Israel, with hundreds of historic, archaeological, and religious sites significant to the Jewish people. Security experts consider the West Bank to be strategically critical for the defense of the Israeli population. It's a highland that rises, several hundred meters above the Tel Aviv coastal area, and you can, shoot rockets or missiles down at them. And with the West Bank, Israel is quite easily defended. This is historically true for thousands of years. The advantages of federalism, right? Jerusalem, where I live, this is sort of what it looks like. The blue is the Israeli Jewish population. The yellow is the Palestinian. And over here, there's a little bit of Israeli Arab, as we would call them, but they call themselves Palestinians. The modern Jerusalem municipality has a population of over 900,000 people, about 62% Jewish and 38% Palestinian or Arab. Hundreds of Palestinians from East Jerusalem attend Israeli university campuses in West Jerusalem. Palestinians in Jerusalem account for nearly 30% of the labor force. Many of them work in West Jerusalem. I go to the grocery store and almost all the workers there are Palestinian. I have Palestinians who work with me in my office and etc. Palestinians are everywhere. It's a highly integrated city. There are sites of religious and historic significance to both Palestinians and Jews can be found throughout the city, and particularly in the Holy Basin area. So, Al-Aqsa Mosque, the Western Wall, Rambam Synagogue, and so on and so forth. The distribution of the population and the level of integration makes dividing the city with physical barriers unfeasible. You have a Jewish population on the other side of a major Palestinian population over the Green Line, and you have a significant amount of integration between the populations that live here. You'd have to make, a very Swiss cheese border to regulate the city, and it's currently not segregated. So that would be seemingly unjust to segregate a non-segregated area in order to quote unquote bring peace. It seems unreasonable from someone who lives here. This is a two-state-based confederation or federation. This is when I first started looking at this problem. I said, I'd do something like this, based on the two-state solution, and then start, making some kind of federation based on two states. So in this context, this is the most basic form of federation. Two states with open borders and a shared capital in Jerusalem. The state of Israel would be 72% Jewish. The state of Palestine with the West Bank and Gaza would be 89% Palestinian or Arab. The shared capital city of Jerusalem, it would be 62% Jewish and 38% Arab. So what's the problem with doing something like that? So it's sort of an unequal partnership. There's significant economic disparity between the states. Israel has a GDP per capita 12 times the size of Palestine. Israel is one of the most powerful militaries in the world, and Palestine is no military. One of the major concerns Palestinians have is in the event of that you leave a large number of Jewish enclaves within a Palestinian state, some kids start throwing rocks at each other, some violence breaks out, and the Israelis will respond and say, well, our civilians are in danger there, let's send in a military to protect them, and then you're back to square one, you're back in an occupation. So that's one of the concerns about a two-state. One of the reasons, like if we have two states, we don't want to have Israelis here. Because then they're a liability to us being invaded again. Israel is on 78% of the territory, not including the Golan Heights, and Palestine is on 22% of the territory. So it's not an even division of land, even though they're roughly half and half of the population. Some Confederation variants don't want to give Palestinians citizenship to Jews living in the West Bank. They say, we'll leave all the Jews as Israeli citizens, we'll make the borders on 67, they'll be Israeli citizens and they'll vote in the Israeli Knesset, but they'll live in Palestine. And in exchange, we'll let Palestinians move there and not vote in Israel. So some of the problems about that is most of the cities where the Jews live in the West Bank are entirely Jewish. Like the city of Ariel is an entirely Israeli city. What's the motivation for the state of Palestine to develop that city? Because none of them are citizens, none of them vote. So you end up with two classes of citizenship in that context. And also the idea is you'd have a large number of Palestinians moving to Israel, who wouldn't really be able to vote, and they'd vote in Palestine. That's not real democracy. That's sort of pretend democracy. Okay, so the Eretz-Ard solution. This is a multi-state federation. This is sort of our proposal as we've developed with Zahir and our other friends. It preserves regional autonomy for various ethnic groups, enables fair distribution of land and resources, encourages cooperation among populations that live near each other, helps preserve parity between the two national groups, and encourages regional economic development. If you look at this, these are the regions of Israel-Palestine. I'll explain a little more, but the blue regions are the most Jewish, or like 90% Jewish. These are about 2/3 Jewish. The dark greens are predominantly Palestinian, or like around 80 to 90% Palestinian. The light greens are maybe 2/3 Palestinian and 1/3 Jewish. And then the yellows are closest to 50-50. The Jerusalem being about 60, well, more like 60-40. Jerusalem is 60% Jewish and 40% Arab. And in Akko in the north, it's about the reverse, about 60% Arab and 40% Jewish, or 60% Palestinian. There's also Druze and Maronite Christians, as I mentioned. But if you look at this map, as I saw in a presentation from Emmanuel, about half of the economy of this entire thing is this canton right here, is the canton of the greater Tel Aviv area. That's nearly half the economy of all of Israel-Palestine. So you really want to enrich and develop and encourage development of other regions of the country and not have a very centralized economy. Eretz-Ard's principles for a federation, Israel-Palestine. So we're talking about one country on all the territory made up of multiple states. We want one immigration policy providing right of return for both people. One federal government with a bicameral parliament made up of representatives of the component states. A bicameral parliament is like you have in the United States with a Senate and a House. Right? Each state gets an even number of senators, and House is dependent on by population. There's one capital in Jerusalem. There's an executive branch with a president and a chairman that rotate. One economy providing prosperity for all the people of Israel-Palestine. Cultural autonomy for both people based on the principle of mutual recognition of indigenous rights and status. One military with no militias. Regional integration through regional economic and security alliances. Okay, so the Eretz-Ard solution is one country on all the territory made up of multiple states, right? We're going to call it the United Federation of Israel and Palestine. Put a little asterisk. There's been a debate over what we should name it: the Federation of Israel and Palestine, the Democratic Republic of Israel and Palestine. There's all sorts of words we can use. I think that it's going to have the word Israel and Palestine in it. That's the name Israel is very, strongly connected with the Jewish ethnicity. Throughout most of Jewish history, we would call ourselves the people of Israel or the house of Israel, depending on which era of Jewish literature you're talking about. That may be more common. In our modern times, we call ourselves the Jews, and we named our country Israel. But the name is still, the idea of taking Israel off the map is quite a challenging thing for Jews, obviously, and Palestinians, I think evenly the same way in terms of their identity as Palestinians. So the United Federation of Israel and Palestine is the name I'll go with for here. We have this cool logo. We have 16 states in total. 8 states have a Jewish majority. 8 states have a Palestinian majority. The total population of the Federation is around 13.3 million. people. The current population is around 53% Jews and others, which includes people with Jewish ancestry who immigrated under the law of return, mostly from the former Soviet Union. Someone with just a Jewish father, but not a Jewish mother, serves in the IDF and considers himself culturally Jewish. We're counting them as Jews here. The Palestinians didn't bring them, we brought them. The current Palestinian Arab population is 47%. So multiple categories of states. In our plan, we decided it would be more than just a Jewish majority and a Palestinian majority. We would break it up into trying to have an evenness by having 5 states that had above 80% or 80 to 90% Jewish, 5 Palestinian majority states that had above 80% Palestinian. So you have a parity between those two. You have 2 states each that are above 60%, about 2/3 Palestinian, and 2 states that are about 2/3 Jewish and 1/3 Palestinian. And then you have 2 yellow states that are about 60-40. We originally also made them blue and light green, but then some Palestinians were like, I'd rather have, make Jerusalem look special. And so we'll say, okay, we'll make it mixed. And we made some special rules for both of the 2 mixed states, as you'll see. This is some of the advantages of the border distribution that we did. For the Palestinian population of Israel, we did an autonomous region in the Western Galilee, the state of Akka or Asher. Each state has sort of 2 names, sort of the name of a city and the name of sort of a cultural tribal region. In the north, they're mostly named after the tribes of Israel. In the south, they're named after various Arab tribes. Right, the state of Akka Asher up in the north enables a mixed population of Palestinian, Arab Israelis, Druze, Maronite Christians, and Jewish Israelis to have regional autonomy, and enables a larger Jewish majority in other regions of Israel. So if you make this an independent state, the state of Haifa becomes more proportionally Jewish. It stays like closer to 90% Jewish, etc. Right. This is the autonomous region in the Eastern Negev. This is also entirely within what's now the state of Israel. This is called the Nabaot Shimon. Nabaot is the first son of Ishmael, and Shimon was one of the sons of Israel. So they both sort of lived in this region. This was part of the Nabatean king. The capital of Nabatea was over here in Mamshit. And so this will enable a mixed population of Bedouin Arab and Jewish Israelis to have regional autonomy. It's about 200,000 people, and it's maybe 60% Bedouin Arab. So that's this region, and it allows resolving land issues and environmental issues regarding the Negev on a local level, and lets people who live next to each other solve their own problems instead of people from Jerusalem dictating them as much as possible. In Gaza, we expanded the size of the state of Gaza. Most of this territory is pretty much empty. There are some small Jewish areas in there, so small Jewish towns. And this gives the Gaza state government. So in our plan, the state governments own the land. So they own state land. I mean, private land is owned by private people, but they take over the Israel Lands Authority. So now the Gaza State Land Authority controls this land. So they can enable affordable housing for Gaza residents by giving grants. If you've been a long-term resident of Gaza, they could give grants to help you, settle and buy a bigger house, and they have plenty of space to do it. We said beyond the green line, the West Bank, Judea, and Samaria. If you notice, this is the green line. This is the supposed border between Israel and the Palestinian state, if there were to be one. So we did not keep to this boundary. We expand the division between the coastal towns and the mountain states to Highway 6. So Highway 6 is mainly the boundary between the coast and the mountain regions. That's about where the mountains end, and the land is flat enough to run a straight highway. And so it expands the central mountain territories beyond the green line up to Highway 6, the beginning of the coastal plain, adds additional Palestinian or Arab Israeli population to the states of Jenin, Menashe, and Nablus Ephraim. So over here, we added some Israeli Arabs to Jenin. We added some Israeli Palestinians. We added Israeli Palestinians to Nablus. And then once you get into Ramallah and into Jerusalem and Hebron, we started adding what are the Israeli Jewish populations as well, which ends up with Ramallah being nearly 40% Jewish, Jerusalem about 60% Jewish, and Hebron still is about 80% or 80% Arab. But at least you have a few more slightly larger Jewish population to give a little greater representation there. Next slide. So looking at land distribution of this map here, I took the area in kilometers squared from each one of these territories. And here you can see, why does it go backwards? Let's see, if I go this way? No, it doesn't go. This is sort of the breakdown of all these type of areas. The Jewish majority states, if you include the Golan Heights, it's 56% Jewish and 43% Palestinian majority states. And without the Golan Heights, you're down to about 53% Jewish majority states and 46% Palestinian majority states. A much fairer distribution than 78-22. And I'll show you the next picture. It's a lot more similar to the proposal of UN Resolution 181, the boundaries. If you notice, there's a place in the Galilee, in the Western Galilee. You also have that in the original 181 plan. The West Bank territories are much wider, similar to the 181, and you even have a similar shape in Gaza that we did. And it's sort of a modern take on UN 181 in terms of division, but it's a federation of 16 states. But in UN Resolution 181, the Jewish population was 33% Jewish and 67% Arab or Palestinian. They would just call them Arabs at that period. And the land was divided 55% for the Jews and 45% for the Palestinians. In our Eretz-Ard plan, the Jewish population is 53% Jewish, and the Palestinian population is 47%. And the land is divided up pretty much 53% to 46.6%. So it's pretty well divided relative to the population, which I think is a nice feature that somehow came out somewhat by accident, but I feel like it's a good sign. One immigration policy providing right of return for both people. I'm going to talk about the Jewish diaspora, just to get some background on the Palestinian diaspora. There are 6.8 million Jews outside of Israel, Palestine. There's over 20 million people eligible for Israel's law of return. That means they have at least one Jewish grandparent. So there's a large population of potential immigrants from the Jewish side. The largest population of Jewish diaspora is in the United States at 5.7 million. Those are not counting Jews that are, one Jewish grandparent, but actual people who actually identify as Jews or are identified as such. Other significant populations are in France, Canada, the UK, Argentina, and many more places. There was about 3.8 million Jews have immigrated to Israel since 1918. So since basically the Balfour Declaration, that's been the amount, and we've about doubled since then, our population within this country. The Palestinian diaspora has 6.36 million Palestinians outside of Israel, Palestine, slightly less than Jewish, but not population, but not so much. More than 5.6 million Palestinians are registered with UNRWA as refugees, of which more than 1.5 million live in UNRWA refugee camps. About half of that, or a little less than half, but a little over 700,000 are living in refugee camps outside of Israel, Palestine, primarily in Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. There's 3.1 million registered refugees living outside of Israel, Palestine. However, 2.1 million of those refugees live in Jordan, and almost all of them have citizenship. So you break it down to about 1.2 million stateless Palestinian refugees outside of Israel, Palestine. So those are the number of Palestinians who live outside the land after we made this federation, who don't have any passport anywhere. So that's the most likely population to want to immigrate. Either the 700,000 that are in refugee camps or the 1.2 million who don't have any passport. That's going to be your major pull. As we've seen also with the Jewish population, we still have a large Jewish population in the United States. They don't all move here. Most of the ones who've moved here historically were the ones who were being persecuted in one way or another, either by the former Soviet Union and various Arab states after the Israel-Palestine conflict started, or fleeing the Nazi Holocaust or the pogroms in Russia. So it's been the vast majority of those 3.8 million have been some type of refugee, similar to my family who moved from the former Russian Empire during the pogroms to the United States. So a smaller group also moved to Israel. Immigration to the Federation. So our plan, how to make this happen in one state, is that we would suggest a 1% annual immigration rate. That's like 1% total. That means out of 13 million people, we can accept about 130,000 immigrants per year. And we would divide that in two. So 65,000 from each group on an annual basis, at least starting, and then that can grow as the 1% increases. The idea there is that it's not about the total number of refugees that were ever to come here, but you have to think in terms of what's a reasonable rate. If you brought 1 million people here in 1 year, that's not a solution, that's a refugee crisis. There's not enough houses, That's similar to what happened when, after the state of Israel was founded, within about 6 years, you doubled the population. You brought this very large population of Jews from the Arab countries, and a lot of them ended up living in the Mabarot. They lived in tents, basically, and it took a long time to integrate them into society, and it caused a lot of economic and social strife by having this massive influx of population that's at a lower, socioeconomic level. So you'd want to have a reasonably staged immigration plan. A similar plan happened when the fall of the Soviet Union, the Iron Curtain fell. There was about 800,000 over 16 years, so roughly 50,000 a year. Israel had about 5 million people, so it was roughly 1% immigration on an annual basis over 16 years, brought this entire influx of what was 800,000 Russian Jews to Israel, and that was largely seen as successful. So that's a good way to go about it. So what we're suggesting is something along the lines of a 20-year plan at this rate, and at that point, you'd have almost all the stateless Palestinians in the world, and all those in refugee camps will have been able to immigrate. You'd have to match them with an even number of Jews. So you'd have to convince, currently the immigration rate of Jews was, prior to Corona, was about 32,000 a year. So we want to push to double Jewish Aliyah, at least during this 20-year plan, at which point you would have, and that's about half of the annual growth rate. The Jews and the Palestinians both have about a 2% annual growth rate. So it's one new immigrant for every 2 babies born for this 20-year plan. And after 20 years, you'd end up with about 24 million people living in the Federation, half Jewish and half Palestinian. That would be the goal, the ideal for immigration. And it's not an unreasonable amount of people to immigrate. It's, and after that, we would assume the immigration demand would significantly drop, because you've then, all the people who were in refugee camps and were stateless have moved here. The immigration rate for both sides will probably slow down to something like it is now, more like 0.3% or something like that, like it is in the United States, for example. Immigrating to the Federation and to a state. So in our plan, we copied an idea from the country of Canada. It is also a federation. And so when you move to Quebec, if you want to immigrate there, you both immigrate to Canada and you also apply to immigrate to Quebec, because they wanted to control how many French-speaking people were in Quebec. So we thought we would sort of imitate this on a countrywide level. So we created sort of two sort of statuses one called for a new immigrant as sort of a probational period. And then after the person had lived there for 5 years, they would be considered a veteran citizen. And so a veteran citizen, which is basically anyone who was a citizen at the time of the founding of the Federation, and anyone who has been living here for 5 years, can move to any state at any time. A new immigrant has to apply to immigrate to the Federation, and they apply to whichever state they want to move to. Once they moved here, they can also apply to a different state, but they still have the status of needing to apply to have permanent residency in another state. Obviously, they can travel and live in other places, but in order to rent an apartment or purchase a home in another place, you would need to do this application. And each state can set up certain criteria for how they prioritize people moving to their states. And the Constitution gives some kind of framework for how much each state is allowed to filter new immigrants into their territory. So this is the sort of suggested rate. The Jewish majority states that are above 80%, the dark blues, the Jewish home states, we would recommend about 2/3 of the new immigrants be from the Jewish background and 1/3 Palestinian. In the dark green states, we would recommend about 2/3 Palestinian and 1/3 Jewish. For the light green states, the ones that are about 2/3, 1/3, we would recommend sort of a proportional immigration rate, 2/3 Palestinian, 1/3 Israeli Jewish, or 1/3 Jewish. For the light blue states, the reverse, 2/3 Jewish and 1/3 Palestinian. And for the yellow states, we agreed to do one for one. So they would each get, even though they're about 60-40, they would over time trend towards 50-50. And they would be your truly neutral states. So now we're going to talk about the parliament made up of representatives of the component states. So we decided on a Senate with 64 senators. So since we went to 16 states, we decided on 4 senators from each state, so that you get a reasonably sized federal Senate. And the lower House of Representatives would have about 34 representatives. You'd have 1 representative for every 100,000 people, more or less, in a state would be distributed. And So you'd end up with 134. And as the federation grew to whatever, the 204, the 24 million people, you'd end up with 240 House of Representatives. And based on the demographics, you'd end up with a situation that would be pretty close to 50-50. And we require the Constitution, in order to amend the Constitution, we require a 4/5 majority. So that, similar to the United States, was actually 2/3. We went a little farther. At least, obviously this is just our, thinking about out loud about how we would do it, but that's what we thought, so that the Constitution would include all the basic things that you would want, all the protections, and it'd be very difficult to change. You would need all of one side and the majority of the other, or a significant majority from both sides to do an amendment. All right, so the House of Representatives are representatives by district. So we did in the Federation, and at least in our proposal, that the districts, similar to how you have counties in the United States, would be the same as the electoral district. So you'd have, instead of making federal redistricting every couple of years and you having all sorts of gerrymandering, and this way the districts that are what are called home rule units, the units of local government, would actually send representatives. And I'll go through an example of how this works out, and it works out pretty well. There's Jewish majority districts are the blue ones. These are like 99% Jewish or above, and the greens are 99 or above percent Palestinian. The light blue are Jewish majority districts that have a small number of Arabs. They can be in the 90s somewhere generally. Light greens are majority Palestinian with a small minority of Jews. The Druze districts, there's a couple over here that have, and I think there are 4 of them that have a Druze majority. There's 2 Circassian majority districts. There's a Maronite Christian majority district up in the north. And yellow districts either had a mix between Jews and Palestinians, or they were basically completely empty, and maybe we could make mixed areas that we would propose to do in those areas. So now I'm just a close-up shot of the same thing. You can see in the north, you can see the Israeli, we call the Israeli Arabs, into the state of Janina and Nablus, the Jewish population that was added to Jerusalem and Ramallah and into Hebron. You can see the large population of Israeli Arabs up in the north. Here's in the south, you see this is where all the Bedouin Arabs live, south of the green line here. And this is Gaza and the additional state. Most of it is actually empty land that was added to Gaza. And so now I'm going to do an example of how this sort of plays out on one state. So I'm going to talk about the state of Jerusalem Al-Quds. It has about 1.6 thousand square kilometers. The Jewish population is a little over 1 million. The Palestinian population is 632,000. It's got a small non-Arab Christian population. The Jewish population is 62%, and the Palestinian population is about 37%, 37.3. These are the districts. I made 16 districts. All of them except for this one are inhabited. This is Qumran. There's really only the Qumran National Park there now, but it seems like a cool place to put like a nice little resort town on this little flat part by the Dead Sea. So I'm in favor of that. It'll be close to me. So there's 15 districts that actually are populated now. 4 of them are overwhelmingly Palestinian. 7 of them are overwhelmingly Jewish. 2 of them are Jewish but have a slight Palestinian population. And there's 2 populated mixed. One is the Holy Basin and Nabi Samuel, which is this little piece over here, which is sort of loosely connected to the Holy Basin. And then Gilo Beit Safafa, which is not too far from me, actually, just south of me, in south of central Jerusalem. And it's actually a Jewish majority, but they have several Palestinian neighborhoods. A lot of them are actually Arab Israelis. There are the federal representatives. You would have 4 senators for the state. You'd have 17 House of Representative seats for the roughly 1.7 million people that live there. You get 2 state senators for each. There's a local parliament for the state of Jerusalem. So each district gets 2 state senators, and you get 1 House of Representatives for every 25,000 people. We actually give everyone 1 seat in the House, plus an additional 1 for each 25,000 people, as we'll see. This is the population statistics of our version of the state of Jerusalem. You can see that the Jewish areas are 99 or 100% Jewish. The Holy Basin is majority Palestinian. An interesting fact about it is it's got a population density of 28,000 people per square kilometer. That's enormous. It actually has a similar population to West Jerusalem, where I live. It's about 120,000 people, but it's a quarter the size. So it's one of the most densely populated places, definitely in the country. And Nabi Samuel is sort of attached to it, and it's got a population of 220 Palestinians, and it's near a sort of a holy site. Gilo Beit Safafa is 86% Jewish and 13% Palestinian. And right, Gush Etzion is an interesting place. It's about 91% Jewish, but also has somewhat of a significant Palestinian population. Then you have all the districts of that are Palestinian. They're basically 100% Palestinian. So how this plays out in terms of senators, each district that has a population that gets 2 state senators. So there's 15 of those. So there's 30 state senators. You have House of Representatives for the state house. That's for every 25,000 people. Or if you don't have 25,000 people, you get at least one. And you can see how those play out. The most populous being East Jerusalem and Northwest Jerusalem. And then how I spread out the 17 seats. Basically, you'd try to get at least one for every 100,000 people. So if you're close to 100,000 people, we give you 1 seat. If you don't even have 100,000 people, we pair you up with a nearby district that has close to that. So, but the 2 of you together get that 1 seat, and you'll see how that plays out. So the Gush Etzion, Neve Shalom, we paired up, and Gilo Beit Safafa and Holy Basin, we paired up to give them 2 seats. And so I'll show you how this plays out. There's about 62%, a little over 1 million, 37% Palestinian, a little over 600,000. And you end up with likely 3 Jewish senators out of the 4 and 1 Palestinian senator. That's because it's pretty, if this was 62.5 and going lower than that, you could already say statistically there's a chance you could get 2 and 2. But as the immigration policy drifts the state closer to 50-50, you'll more likely get this 50-50 split. The state senators, there's 20 Jewish state senators and 10, because there's more districts that are Jewish majority currently. There may be, as Qumran comes, it might shift the balance closer. So it's about 2/3, 1/3 in terms of the districts. In terms of the state house, which is closest to the proportionality, you're at 62.6 and 37.3. That's almost exactly like the proportional to the population. And then the federal house, you're at 64%. You've got 11 seats versus 6 seats. That's how it plays out. It's pretty close to proportionality. But one of the advantages you have, you get a senator from Bethlehem. It's not our House of Representative. He's not, some random circle that includes this guy and this guy. He represents this population group that has a very specific interest. So we sort of federalized the cantons themselves, which I thought was a good idea for coming from Jerusalem, where you have you have areas that are entirely Palestinian, entirely Jewish, and there's not a lot of mixed regions. Now we're going to look at the land distribution. So what you see is the 52% of the state is Jewish majority regions. So those are these dark blue. So the Jerusalem state itself is quite a large amount of the territory is populated by Jews. This is all on the Israeli side of the green line, so that's why there's so much of that there. There's about 23% of the territory, 23.5 is the Palestinian majority areas. So the mixed Jewish majority areas, that's here in Neve Shalom. Neve Shalom has this one town where there's half Jewish and half Palestinian by design, and hopefully we will build off of that and make a more mixed area in Neve Shalom and Gush Etzion. The mixed areas take up about 1.4% of the territory, and about 6% of the state is mostly here is the uninhabited areas. Also, there's a federal district where the Knesset is and stuff that's out of the thing. So it's of the inhabited area, it's about 69% is Jewish majority areas, and 23% within the state of Jerusalem are Palestinian majority areas. So now we'll talk about the city of Jerusalem. So our idea was to expand the city boundary, called it New Jerusalem, Yerushalayim HaChadash, or El Kudesh Dide, just to give it an interesting name. It's about 278 kilometers squared. It's roughly the size of Queens, New York. It's not that massive, but it's double the size of the current city of Jerusalem. And the current city of Jerusalem has about half the population of Queens, New York. So you could easily fit, at not too heavy of a population density, about twice the population here. So that was the idea. As the country grows, we'd want some of the major cities to be able to expand. And so Jerusalem would be one great example of that. One, more balanced demographics. So by doing this, you change it from the current demographics, where it's about 2/3, 1/3, closer to 50-50, and a more equal distribution of land within the city itself, the city limits, leading to that, 50-50 city. Things keep going backwards. All right, these are the statistics. The Jewish population of Al-Quds Jideh, this is today, without, projecting, is a little less than 60% Jewish and a little over 40% Palestinian. So you're a little closer to 50-50. And the land is roughly 50-50. It's 51 to 48 in terms of Jewish majority regions versus Palestinian majority regions. So that's our idea for the city of Jerusalem. So now we're going to talk about the executive branch, the president and chairman with rotation. There's one president and chairman are elected as a ticket. The idea here is not that you're going to say the president has to be Jewish and the Palestinian the chairman has to be Palestinian. You could run two Japanese people if they're both citizens. But we want to avoid what they did in Lebanon, where they pick specific ethnic groups for specific positions, because that, as you saw how that played out in Lebanon, it ends up running into trouble. You end up with people holding their position way too long, all sorts of trouble. So what we wanted to do, though, is create a situation where the most probable combination of representatives would be one Palestinian and one Israeli that knew each other, because they would be able to draw votes from both populations, right? So the president is the head of state. He oversees foreign affairs and is the commander of chief of the military. The chairman oversees primarily internal affairs. Ministry appointments are divided between them and the parliament. So instead of how you have the current system where you have a coalition-based government, the Westminster system that we use now, we're going to use this where you basically have party heads that agree to form a coalition, and they do exchanges, negotiations for seats for ministry positions, which helps further their career and boost their resumes and etc. So what we would have is more like the United States, where these people would just appoint their cabinet. But instead of just all going to the president, we'd split it up between the president, the chairman, and a couple key ministries we give over to the parliament so that they didn't get messed around between either of the two. And they're elected for a term of 4 years with a rotation after 2 years. And so overall, two terms that you would do for these two guys. So I'm going to do an example of just what that would look like. Kind of funny example. So let's say Drake and DJ Khaled. Drake is a Canadian Jewish rapper. Well, his mother's Jewish, so he's Jewish. And DJ Khaled is a Palestinian DJ, and they're friends. They do songs together. Let's say both of them decided to make Aliyah or Hakal Auda, and they came here and they decided to run for parliament together. They thought they could do it better. So this is what that would look like. President Drake would be in charge of the defense, public security, finance, economy, tourism, science, technology, foreign affairs, meaning he would appoint the minister. He would, get to meet with him, and he could fire him and pick a new one if he didn't do his job well. So that's basically the job of what they get to do in terms of the ministries. And then the chairman, DJ Khaled, would be in charge of picking the minister of the interior, the minister of health, education, transportation, agriculture, environmental protections, communication, culture, construction, and housing. And then after 2 years, they switch, and if you were the president, you would want to pick a chairman that you trusted so he doesn't screw it up and then you have to clean up his mess 2 years later. So it's a rotation, similar to what you're doing now with Naftali Bennett and Yair Lapid. Only most probably one would be Jewish and one would be Palestinians, and hopefully they would get along better than Naftali Bennett and Yair Lapid. And then the parliament would pick the justice minister, the Supreme Court judges, although the president and the chairman could get a veto, the immigration and integration ministry, so they get to set that number in terms of what's the annual rate of immigration and sort of regulate that, and the religious affairs and sacred sites. So they would be managing the Western Wall, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, Ibrahimi Mosque, Hammam, Machpelah, all these important sites. They would just get managed by this sort of 50-50 parliament, and you wouldn't have to worry about the president and chairman fighting over them. Okay, now I'm going to talk about the economy. One economy providing prosperity for all the people of Israel, Palestine. Just a little background. This is the current Israeli economy, this is current Palestinian. Just to note, the Palestinian population of East Jerusalem is counted in Israel and subtracted from Palestine. That's how you figure out how many people are in Israel, Palestine. You take the Israeli numbers and the Palestinian numbers and you minus East Jerusalem from one of those sides because both of them claim it for various political reasons. So there's 9.5 million people, 0.05 million people in Israel. There are 4.33 million people in Palestine, not including East Jerusalem, which they don't have control of East Jerusalem, so it's not really so relevant. The GDP of Israel is 334 billion US dollars. The GDP of Palestine is $16.28 billion. It's significant disparity. This is, I think, 25 times wealthier than Palestine is Israel. The GDP per capita is $43,500 per person per month. The GDP per capita is $3,000. Oh no, this is annual. GDP per capita is annual. The average Israeli, it doesn't really spread out quite this nicely, but in theory makes $43,000 a year. The average Palestinian makes $3,000 a year. Again, a significant disparity. The unemployment rate in Israel is 5.5%. The unemployment rate in Palestine is 27.8%. Life expectancy in Israel is 82.8 years. Life expectancy in Palestine is 73.39 years. The average housing price in shekels is 1.5 something million shekels. That's an actual statistic from, I think, the World Bank. The housing prices from Palestine, this is a quick survey I did with some friends of mine looking at apartments in the Ramallah area. So this is even a sort of a wealthy look at Palestine. It's about 500,000 shekels. So a third, and that's not really an average. That's an average in a somewhat well-developed urban area. The school enrollment, this is tertiary. That means how many people go to university. So we're at 61% of our high school graduates go on to college. They're at 43%, not terrible, but not as good as Israel currently. This is what if you merged Israel-Palestine. This is today's Israel-Palestine economy. You have 13.38 million people. You have a GDP of 410 billion US dollars. You're the 28th largest economy in the world. Congratulations. The GDP per capita is 30,900 US dollars. You're the 31st highest in the world. Unemployment rate is 12.75%, slightly better when you average them together. Life expectancy is at 79.9 years. It's also not too bad. And the average housing price is 1.25 million shekels. And the number of people going to college is 55%. So let's look at projections in 20 years. I looked for these statistics. We took a look at the reunification of Germany as our sort of case model, and what happened after you merged the economy of East Germany with West Germany over 20 years. There was certainly a hiccup there where you had several years of lower employment in East Germany because they didn't have the same level of qualifications as people in West Germany. But after about 20 years, they sort of came out of it, and then the overall GDP was quite good. And so the population of 24 million people, as we discussed before, you'd have nearly a trillion, 998 billion US dollar GDP. You're the 18th largest economy in the world. You have a GDP per capita of 41,592, almost as high as you had before as just Israel, but you're still the 22nd highest in the world, which is good. Unemployment rate is back down to 6.2. It's almost where it was just in Israel now. Life expectancy has risen back to where it was. This is based on Israeli statistics with the Israeli and the Israeli Arabs. You should be back to everyone living to at least 82.8 years in this period of time. Your average housing price is about 1.7 million shekels. So it's gone up a little bit in 20 years, but that's actually not so bad. And school enrollment is expected to get up to about over 70%. So that's in going to university. So that's quite a nice economy looking on, at least in terms of statistics for an Israel-Palestine economy. Okay, now I'm going to talk about cultural autonomy for both people based on the principle of mutual recognition of indigenous rights and status. So what I mean is indigenous, not in terms of arguing over who was here first and who is the real descendants of the Canaanites, but using the concept that's sort of embedded in the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People to guarantee the rights of, let's say you think of the Cherokee or the Lakota in the United States. What is the right of a nation living inside of a modern multi-ethnic country that still identifies as a nation? So in our plan, we are saying the Jewish and Palestinian people are each recognized as a national group. We're a nation. We're the nation. We're Am Yisrael, like the Lakota are or the Cherokee Nation is a nation within the United States. So we're considered a nation. We have the right to preserve cultural symbols such as flags, anthems, other national symbols. We can represent ourselves like we are a nation, even though we're sharing a country with another nation. We have the right to preserve our language and culture, right to education in our own language and culture. We have the right to refer, that's in the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. You can refer to states, cities, the entire country in your culturally authentic way. So I can just call it, I live in Israel. Right? The right to access all historical and religious sites, right? Like the Wailing Wall, Al-Aqsa Mosque, and etc. And the idea conceptually is we're a federation of two nations, where the nations that we're merging are not Israel and Palestine, the countries, they're Israel and Palestine, the people groups. We are the nations, and we are what are in this union together. So I could think of myself as, I live in Eretz-Ard, I live in the land of Israel. I'm part of Am Yisrael, the people of Israel. I could have Degel Yisrael, the flag of Israel. There's no Medina Yisrael, there is Medinat Yerushalayim. I live in the state of Jerusalem, but that's not such a big change. And other than that, my life is pretty normal. I think of myself as Israeli and I live my Israeli life. And they could be my next door neighbor with the Palestinian flag hanging down his window, thinking he lives in Palestine, you know, singing Fidai and waving the Palestinian flag and, you know, let everyone enjoy their lives. That's not enough of a reason not to make one country and get along here. Okay, now we're talking about one military with no militias. So we're going to call it the Israel-Palestine Defense Force. The point of no militias is that you have significantly reduced the probability of sectarian violence. As you see, Lebanon is a good model of how merging ethnic groups into one country can go terribly wrong. If you let each ethnic group have their own militia, then they'll have enough weapons to start shooting at each other. If there's only one army, and it's the army, you know, of Israel-Palestine, one of the most powerful armies in the world, there's not really a possibility. There could be riots, there could be, you know, discontent, but you can't have, you know, all-out war you can't have a civil war. It's built off of the current Israeli military. So you'd start with what you have now and a gradual increase of Palestinian recruits in the service of defending Israel-Palestine. Here's an image of Muslim, I believe, Bedouin or Palestinian soldiers in the IDF today. And here are their Qurans they receive after they, you know, get their hat and they're ready to be soldiers, and they get their machine guns. And apparently that works. That's a model of having a Palestinian population in the Israeli army that works now. So we would sort of build on that. Obviously, we'd call it the Israel-Palestine Defense Force to make people feel included, but it would basically be what it is now, and over time, increasing the number of Palestinian conscripts. My personal opinion is to make a conscription and to make a draft like you have in Switzerland, even though you'll say, well, we're probably not going to be at war with anybody. It's also a nice idea for creating social cohesion and team building, because you'll have people who grew up in different towns next to each other they didn't go to school together, they don't know each other that well, but you force them into a unit, you make them run miles and do push-ups together. This sort of builds that sense of cohesion, the sense of common mission, and armies are good at getting people to behave themselves. So that's a good way for a good structured environment for people to, you know, make a few friends from the other side that hopefully they'll keep touch with, and that'll sort of create that fabric of a shared society using the military. So I'm pro conscription. There's some people in our group who are saying, yeah, I don't like the draft. You know, that's up for debate, but at least I thought I'd share what if we did. Creating regional security alliances for greater regional stability, right? I'll mention more, but currently the U.S. is in a process of withdrawing from the Middle East somewhat. They've withdrawn from Afghanistan, also withdrawn from Iraq. The United States has become energy independent, so they're not as interested in putting American soldiers in the Middle East, and what they're trying to do is create an alliance between the Jews and the Arabs so that we can hold the fort down and they can get out of here and take care of their own problems. So that's really where the long-term trend here is in the Middle East. And so we definitely want to be part of that, as building alliances between Jews and Arabs regionally. I think starting in Israel-Palestine is we've actually done it even outside, but starting in Israel-Palestine is a great way to propel that forward and to a significant extent. Right, I'm going to talk about the current Israeli military. We have 169,500 active duty personnel. We're the 29th largest military in the world. We have 465,000 reserves. We have 634,500 people. We're the 18th largest military in the world. We have a $20.5 billion US budget, which is the 4th largest budget in the world. We do spend a whopping 5.3% of GDP. That's unusually large for a country of our size, but we have serious defense issues, and that's how we have such a powerful army with that expense. The Israel-Palestine, this is taking the population that we're going to have at that time and sort of applying current Israeli statistics. It could be even larger, but we would expect, using the same numbers that Israel has today relative to the proportion, relative to the population, we would have 449,500 active duty personnel. We're the 9th largest military in the world now. We have 1.2 million reserves. The total personnel will be 1.681 million people. It's the 10th largest military in the world, which is the largest military in the Middle East. It would have, if we use the same percentage of GDP applied to our now expanded wealthy GDP in 20 years, we'd be spending 52.9 billion US dollars on our military. We'd have the 6th largest military in the world, just after the United Kingdom. So we are also the largest and most wealthy military in the Middle East by far. It is still a lot to spend 5.3% of GDP on our defense. So that, that's why we have democracy. I'm sure that will be hotly debated how much money goes to defense when it's no longer necessary. But just to sort of throw out the statistics, what it would look like if we kept spending the same proportion we do now, we would have by far the dominant military force in the Middle East, and we'd be one of the wealthiest countries in the Middle East. So things are looking up for us in Israel, Palestine. Regional integration through economic and security alliances. The first alliances, besides the alliances we already have, that we should work on is Lebanon and Syria, because these are some of our biggest problems. And what our strategy towards getting there was the idea of purchasing the Golan Heights. So the advantage of the Golan Heights, it provides maximum territorial protection for Israel, Palestine. This country is very difficult to invade from almost every area. There's a huge valley, one of the deepest rifts in the entire world on our eastern flank. There's a very flat coast, which is very hard to land on our west. We have a massive desert all to the south of us. There's mountains all over between us and Lebanon. The way you break into Israel, Palestine is this little valley right here, the Bekaa Valley. This is historically, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, you name it, they invaded us from there. So we would want to keep the Golan Heights, so it gives you the access to this mountain, which is twice the height of any other mountain in the region. It's the Mount Hermon. It's the highest mountain in Levant, I think 22,000 meters, if I'm not mistaken, above sea level. So, no, 2,000 meters, not 20. It's not Mount Everest. At 20,000. I mean, 2,000 meters above sea level, but it gives you a significant vantage point. You can see into Damascus, you can see into Lebanon. We would offer fair market value for the land to Syria and Lebanon, so we would offer to buy it from them, even though the U.S. recognized it. It's not going to be so popular amongst our new Palestinian partners to take the land from Syria and Lebanon from their perspective, but they're okay with the idea of us paying for it. We would renounce Jewish land claims to Harwan and Darwa. So when the early Zionists moved here, they actually bought a bunch of the land in the Golan Heights and adjacent in Syria. So we would agree that any land beyond the Golan Heights will trade back. It can become the state land, will no longer have any claims for it. And we're paying to switch the boundaries into saying that it's in our country. We'll offer an economic and security alliance with Syria and Lebanon. We can have free trade. We can offer defense. They no longer need to rely on undemocratic countries like Russia or Iran for their defense. Israel, Palestine can easily protect them if they need. So that will offer those advantages. We want process of democratization and improvement in both of those countries. So we would sort of caveat it. So, okay, we'll do this union with you. We'll do a free trade agreement and security alliance, but we want to see steps towards free and fair elections and et cetera. We want to secure citizenship for the Palestinians in Syria and Lebanon who choose not to immigrate. So we're going to have this open immigration policy. The largest group of non-citizen Palestinians out there are both in Lebanon and in Syria. A large number of them in Syria are actually refugees throughout the rest of the world since this conflict, but they were in Syria until not too long ago. There's still a good number there. They do not have Syrian citizenship. In Lebanon, the situation is particularly dire. It's maybe even worse than what's going on in the West Bank. They literally live in cities that are walled in, and they have a limited freedom of movement throughout Lebanon, and they're barred from any types of jobs. So they're heavily discriminated against in Palestine. Palestinians in Lebanon are discriminated against. So part of making this deal with us would be you'd have to cut that out. You're going to have treat people, Palestinians in your country, with equality, and that's part of one of the other things we're going to demand from them. And then now, if you take Israel, Palestine with Lebanon and Syria, and you add all of Israel's current and really potential. So I added all the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Sudan. You can't really see Morocco, but these are the people who just signed the Abraham Accords, plus Egypt's current allies of Egypt and Jordan. Saudi Arabia and Oman are pretty under the cover allies of Israel as it speaks. Obviously, if we had an Israel-Palestine Federation, they would be the first to, open an embassy in the new United Federation, Jerusalem. So this is sort of what our allies structure would start to look like, and obviously we can add more of our Greece could be part of our thing. We'd obviously want to try to pull in Iraq and Kuwait and some of the other Arab countries. But this is quite a large regional alliance. We would like free trade agreements, a security umbrella provided by Israel Palestine with this pretty massive army. We would want visa-free travel, ideally, if things would go that direction between all these countries, and regional stability and prosperity. You know, we would have this and democratization. We would try to encourage people, you know, like the European Union, in order to join this this agreement with us, they have to make steps towards free and fair elections and stuff like that, and then they get to be part of our liberal democratic club. So that's the plan for Israel Palestine. I think it's my last slide. Thank you so much for your time. Are there any questions?
Okay, I'll ask a question. Do you have any specific plans for improving the economic development of the other regions of Israel besides the one surrounding Tel Aviv, which, as you said, is disproportionately large in its economy relative to its land area and population?
Right. So for starters, making a federation helps you in that direction, because each one of these states can charge some taxes. They can charge what's now we call Arnona. You can actually, like states like California, charge a certain amount of income tax. So you have an ability to tax from the state level. So they start to get a budget, and they can decide how much people pay taxes in their state. So there could be lower tax bracket states and more expensive tax bracket states that can encourage businesses to move to these other states. There's lower cost of housing. Once you free up this Israel Palestine, it becomes cheaper for, let's say, Intel or some major company to move to, let's say, somewhere near Nablus, for relative to Renana, will probably cost him a quarter of the price for land, as we saw. You know, land prices are a lot lower around there. So he could use that money to then buy a bigger staff. Salaries are going to be cheaper a little bit there. You do have a large number of educated people. So making this federation does that, encourage that economy. Obviously, you know, grants from international organizations, encouraging, low cost of doing business in Israel, low taxes to encourage foreign, to have run an economy similar to other small countries like maybe Denmark or Ireland or other places where they encourage, or Dubai, where they have low regulation and low taxes to encourage foreign companies to come there. That's one thing. I'm also in favor of developing local, manufacturing. I think going the German model is sort of the way to go. A partnership between universities, businesses. There's a lot you can do on the economic and level. And yeah, we have people who are working in our group to try to come up with, there's idea of more like it's called municipalism. It's a concept within sort of vogue in sort of European local politics, for how to get the city to be more efficient and encourage, more efficient uses of resources. And this model, what we're doing is very much like that municipalism type framework. You're basically making 16 city states. Each one of these states is basically the size of a city and sort of an extended suburban realm around it of sorts. And so it's essentially has one major economic area, and then sort of the suburban satellite areas that sort of go around this main economy. So each place is sort of focusing on building its own city state in a sense. So I think that the model itself helps move the economies to distribute them, and motivates locals to develop their own state.
I have a few comments, if I may.
Mm-hmm.
First
Sure.
of all, it's I've read the plan before, but I haven't seen you show it, and it's a great vision. It really is a great vision, and it's fantastic to see what actually could be done out of this piece of land if we just get our act together. Okay. That having been said, it's like designing some kind of aircraft without the limitations of physics. Okay, it's a great thing to look up to and to want to attain it, but realistic politics at this time won't allow it. Okay, that doesn't mean it mustn't be here. Okay, it has to be here because, like I said, it's a great vision. And what you have done, which we haven't done, you've gone a lot into the details, about the immigration things. And there's a lot of things which you said that I think I'll adopt with your permission. Okay,
Sure.
I'll give you credit.
Sure.
So we think that we shouldn't go too much into the details to leave it up to the people to decide on some of the things, but it's always good to have some kind of guideline and say, we could do this, because then people say, well, maybe that's not such a bad idea. So I like some of the things you did. And I just want to tell you again that you're a whiz with maps and with numbers. And it's great to have you on the Federation board all together. Okay, so it's always good to be able to go back to you for some resources to redraw the cantons or to make them bigger or make them smaller. And you've done a lot of work also, so I really appreciate that. Thanks a lot.
My pleasure. Yeah, I'd be happy to meet up, and we can, what we made was maybe a couple of years ago. I thought about doing the map a lot since then. Originally, when I met with you and I met with Kamal, I thought, maybe what if I could take Emmanuel's plan that I made this map and sort of meet Kamal like halfway, because Kamal was saying, let's make a 50-50 federation. But I really liked that it was made out of cantons. His was a 2-state based federation. So I was like, what if I made an even number of cantons out of the thing? So I added Gaza, and I ended up with like 39 cantons. It ended up with way too many because I added an even number for the palace. And then I'm like, this is great, but it's a big mess. So then we started to simplify things down. And as we went through the iterations.
Well, the parity is the big advantage, definitely to the Palestinians, and it's a huge drawback to the Jews. Okay,
sure,
because it's just not politically correct. Okay, to put it that way.
Right. No, it's a psychological leap to get to that.
Yeah, no, it's good to put it out there because when people look at it, I'll be very happy if they look at your federation and say, "Oh, this is crazy. Let's go to Emmanuel's federation." If we get to that stage, we're in good shape. Anyway, so really that was your main guideline to make it parity, and I think you did a great job there.
Thank you.
I have a question for you.
Sure.
Have you had any luck in the Knesset?
No, you can't get people in the Knesset to do this. In order to get something like this to happen, you would need to prove that you had a significant amount of support amongst the public.
Right.
And so we actually did some initial pilot polling amongst people we knew from Facebook and stuff like that, and we got pretty good results from amongst Israelis, at least younger Israelis who use Facebook, who we were able to find. So we got something like 46% of Israelis, at least that we were able to poll. We're not like on a cold poll. Obviously, we gave them a whole pitch and talked to them and convinced them, and then we were able to get a decent amount of support. But that doesn't mean I have 40% of Israel. I have 40% of whatever the few hundred people we bothered to pitch to over a couple months. So you would have to spread this to prove that I have 5% of this or 10%. Then you could get a party to support it or make a new party that would win seats. That's how Israel's a democracy. So you need to have actual numbers and proof, and
you got to have.
There are good polls. There are good polls done by Shkaki and also on the Israeli side regarding the one state approach without defining exactly what one state is becoming more popular on both sides in significant percentages. Okay, so there's an article in Al Monitor by Ksenia Svetlova from 2020, which shows some of those statistics. I think
that's the zeitgeist. the world, we're moving there, because the idea that 2 states are going to happen is unrealistic to everybody, and people are starting to get like, and there's a lot more interaction, you have with Facebook and social media. 20 years ago, if you lived in Tel Aviv, you wouldn't really know any Palestinians, but now everyone can know like 10 Palestinians that are on their Facebook friends, and they show pictures of their cousins graduating from school, and they personalize each other. There's a humanization that's happened over the fact that there's the amount of media that we have these days.
People are getting tired of the conflict. It's just dragging out too much.
How effective are you with the media in Israel?
I don't know. We've just gotten started. We're doing some of these shows, so I think we could be pretty effective.
No, on social networks, actually for groups like ours, which are off the beat track in a way, the social media are the best way to spread the world. The media, the conventional media, stay away from things like that because they're very much rating oriented.
Right.
So if you offer something which they don't know what the public thinks about, they're not going to put it into they're not going to put it on, or they're going to put it on as the crazies or something like that.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, my friend Rudy did a thing, I think, on Khan Schlossesrei, and one of the regular mainstream news, they interviewed him, and he talked a little bit about a federation. And he's well known as a sort of a social media personality promoting Israel and stuff like that. But he did mention the idea of a federation, and so here and there. But it's not like it's not considered mainstream yet. But I think that's definitely that's where we want to take it. And I think it's Emmanuel did a show, some kind of news thing that I saw.
I've been on some conventional media and had some articles even in Eretz, and I just had one in I-24 today. So it's moving, but it's still not there. It's still the watershed is going from 2 states to 1 state, which is like a major paradigm step, and Jews are very uncomfortable with it. Palestinians are less uncomfortable with it, but Jews are very uncomfortable with it, and the media are just reflecting the public in that respect.
Okay, Rafi, by the way, there's a question in the chat.
Sure.
So I don't know if you see it.
No,
how
I don't.
do you think the plan is implemented, given the number of entrenched things that need to change?
I've changed a lot of things that are already rooted in there. How do you think this plan? In terms of my idea of how to implement this plan, you start with a massive public movement. You have to get the people to actually want to do it, and they will make the change. Mainly from voting, or the impending threat that they will vote for a party that will do this, because obviously they're going to make noise. They're going to get on the streets. They're going to have like you could have protests, or you could just have signs. It doesn't really matter. You could have a parade. But you just need to get a lot of people supporting this idea. On the Palestinian side, obviously you're going to need similar amount of support, and there's a little bit of challenges because of anti-normalization, because of funding for the PA. But I could even start with Israel. Ultimately, what we'd want to do is you want to bring it down to a referendum. You'd want to force the governments on both sides to have an open referendum, and you have to know you're going to win it. And then you'd have the majority of Israelis vote yes, sort of this is what they did in South Africa. They had a vote, like, do you want to end apartheid and give the black people the right to vote? So they're going to vote to end the conflict and to have one democratic country. And then the Palestinians would likewise vote yes for that. And then you implement it. Obviously, once everyone voted yes, then you have to have, security experts and develop a staged plan for how to go from transferring power from the current infrastructure to having these multiple states created, you'd have to have new elections set up. So you'll have to have a whole rollout and transition from the current government to this new federation government. But that's easier to do once everyone's on board. Once that's the law, like once everyone voted for that and that's what's going to happen, that's what you do. So the way I would see it is you get everyone to vote on it on both sides. On the Palestinian side, you may have some objection from the Palestinian Authority. Ultimately, Israel and the international community can put pressure on the PA to do it if they really give such a hard time. And they're getting a lot of protest against them as they speak now. So
it's one man, one vote. They don't get more than one vote, you know, the members of the Palestinian Authority. So they're going to lose out. The Palestinian public is going to go for something like this in no time.
Yeah, but in our polling, the Palestinian support was overwhelming. It was like, you know, nearly 90%.
But it's not really fair. It's not really fair in a way, because the Palestinians are downtrodden. Okay, and when they're so low down, they're going to pick up on anything. But I share your feelings about the likelihood that the Palestinians are going to be very much supportive, even though it's a little bit unbalanced. But
our idea is that in my
deal.
proposal, we're talking about some kind of a partnership. They could say, well, we would want more. Each side, they could say you want more, but you can't ask for more than 50-50. That's as far as you can go. That's where you hit the middle and say, okay, now that's as good as it gets.
No, Rafi, if I may, I think from an outsider's point of view, it seems that what's needed is a sense of unity between the two populations, and that's what's missing.
Sure.
So
in our vision, the movement to create the federation is what does the reconciliation. If they see you marching together with them, like, you know, the March on Washington with Martin Luther King, when the Black people saw the white people and the Jewish people coming with them, then they see that we're allies and we're not enemies. But you have to make that step. You have to. So in our vision, the movement to get there, getting people to the point where we would all vote yes, or a vast majority of us would vote yes in the referendum. If we're there, then we're there. Then we made that leap. We want to live with these people as equals and as our neighbors. Getting everyone to that point, that's the reconciliation. And then obviously after, you're gonna have a Truth and Reconciliation Committee and all the various traumas that have happened you have to go through and work out and all that, counseling and all sorts of stuff. But that's where you bring that unity. The unity is the unity for the civil rights movement or the equal rights movement in Israel, Palestine. That sort of creates that.
Yes. Okay, thank you. So this is a great place to end the recording. Thank you all for the discussion. Thank you all for listening in. I'm going to turn off the recording and we can continue the discussion, which is a great discussion, off of the air.